expression that emerged out of anti-racism work, ultimately pointing toward the beloved community which embraces an intersectionality that didn't even have a name when he was working. He saw the interconnections of race and poverty. And it wasn't until he set his sights on the financial and economic situation that it was deemed he was too threatening. But make no mistake, these are interrelated. He was a flawed individual, which should go without saying. Who is not? We are not, or we are, I should say. Sorry, you thought you were like, wow, I'm not flawed, super. You're loved, you're worthy, you have inherent worth and dignity, but you are, I am, flawed. We cannot let that hold us back. We proceed in spite of our mistakes. Hopefully, we find a way to account for them. And that's a good thing today, because I am about to make a lot of mistakes, I'm sure. When we start talking about the culture of white supremacy, there is a lot to know. There is a lot to unpack, and I am only at the beginning of this journey. I have said things from this or similar pulpits that, in retrospect, were egregious. I'm not going to recount them for you, but I know that I have. Even though at the time I thought I was doing the good work. There's ever more learning to be done. And there's no flawless way, there really is no flawless way to do this. It is difficult. And we must become comfortable with being uncomfortable. So the legacy of white supremacy is our background. It is in the air that we breathe, and it is the context in which we negotiate our identity, no matter what your identity is. We do this both consciously and sub- and trans-consciously. We are each flawed human beings, bearing highly personal traumas and blessings, just you being you. And you come into this conversation, which is fraught with all of that. The inherited marks of white supremacist culture influences us to a significant degree. It is not the only foible in play, however, and that makes the extremely stubborn pathogen of racism all the more difficult to isolate and cut out. So, what is white supremacy as we are currently using it in the parlance of the day? Actually, before I do that, I want to tell you a little about how I interact with traumatic news or vocabularies or events, even when they're quite personal or if they're national news. So I remember on the morning of 9/11, 2001, I clicked on my computer, and the headline came up, had a picture of a plane going into a building, and I clicked it off and turned on my email. I did not stop. It registered, and I immediately looked away. I was not ready to process that reality. And it stuck in the back of my head, but I needed a few minutes. Later, of course, whether I wanted to or not, that day was going to be what that day was. But I move away from trauma. I move away from discomfort, effectively, at first. And I think I hope, since I do it, I hope that that's okay. Because as long as you have the capacity to, after you've gathered yourself, return to the discomfort. So I say that because this term white supremacy, this mode of analysis, I know can be shocking, can be felt emotionally, can cause people to put their hands up and back away. And I want to tell you that actually that's okay. It's not okay for you to always do that. But if you need to do that for a moment, all right. So I want to define a little bit what I mean by white supremacy. You might think that we do not live under the aegis of white supremacy, or that to name our culture as such is just too much. That white supremacists are the neo-Nazis, the skinheads, but not us. The truth is, I think, that in fact it's a continuum, and we are on it. Not because we want to be. We were born into it. Doesn't mean that we haven't perpetuated it, either consciously or unconsciously. But what our work is to do is to become conscious of it so that we can extricate ourselves from it, at least some, as individuals and as a culture. So I hope to demonstrate that we do, in fact, live in a culture of white supremacy. I mean, the foundational document of our nation did not qualify African Americans as full human beings. It guaranteed a lot of rights, and then maintained that somebody from Africa was not a full human. Of course, as history moves on, we've passed through slavery, which has an enduring effect, undeniably, and continues as a vestige in some institutional elements of our culture. For instance, redlining, which was popular during the Jim Crow era. Redlining was a discriminatory practice of fencing off an area on a map, not with real fences necessarily, where banks would avoid investments based on that community's demographics. It's a systematic denial of various services to residents of specific, often racially associated neighborhoods and communities, either directly or through the selective raising of prices. Now, you may think that segregation only happened in the South, but redlining happened in the West, in the North, in Tucson. It was de facto segregation via the banks, via money. And it had the effect of limiting the wealth that could accrue to families living in that area. The housing in that area was always going to be worth less than the housing in areas that weren't designated as redlined areas. So the generational wealth that has a chance to accumulate, in my instance, was hampered in other instances. That is an institutional example of a racial understanding. So that sort of kneecapping of wealth over the generations continues in the form of for-profit prisons. They profit, or prisons in general, and specifically in for-profit prisons, which limit the earning and wealth capacity of Black America and actually funnel money into white America. So those are a couple of examples that clearly have hurt Black people in this country and have also clearly benefited white people in this country. So these are just a few examples of historical events and decisions that privileged whites and white culture at the expense of other cultures. So that is an institutional embodiment of racism. That, in fact, in every case was at the time legal, deemed just by our culture and society. Intentional. Now, so that's institutional racism. There is also, of course, cultural racism and aspects of white supremacy. And some of these include, I am told, perfectionism, sense of urgency, worship of the written word, fear of open conflict, to name a few. And, honestly, I don't think that there's anything in and of themselves that are really wrong with any of those. However, when we use those as the norm, and we can think about this even in our congregation and how we do business, when we use perfectionism and sense of urgency as a norm, not all cultures operate that way. And it has the effect of excluding those who operate in a different mode. When we operate with a fear of open conflict, we run the risk of alienating those for whom open conflict is more easily accessible and not as traumatic as it is for me. I hate open conflict. But to be open to it institutionally becomes important so that we can cultivate, well, not cultivate, that's the wrong word, so that we can be open to other cultures. And then when you couple that, these aspects of white culture, and I would even say, not that I'm an expert, so take it with a grain of salt, but I would say that I would locate this specifically in Northern European and English white culture, that when you couple those aspects with a history of institutionalized oppression that has gone on for centuries, it becomes difficult to extricate our culture from the oppressions committed in its name. And this results in a privileged place for people like me. White privilege does not mean that we want to strip white people of privilege, by the way. It's a simple observation that due to what I've just described, that white people have advantages that are culturally, institutionally, historically, and presently supported and reinforced, where other people that we are around, that live in our country, that are guaranteed the same rights, simply do not have. I heard, or I read recently as we prepare for this class on dismantling white supremacy, Hannah, one of our co-facilitators, gave me a blog entry by an author, a science fiction author named John Scalzi. And, science fiction, so he's kind of a nerd. And he, speaking in the metaphor of the nerdocracy, said that being white is like playing the video game on the easiest setting. You level up easier. You get through the maze. The maze is less difficult. There's less obstructions. And that's, I find, a very helpful way of conceiving of white privilege. And it's, of course, often unexamined. And as long as it's unexamined, as long as we're not aware of our context, we run the risk of doing harm and perpetuating the system that we consciously know is wrong. We know that racism is wrong, obviously. I mean, we're Unitarian Universalists. Cognitively, we know that racism is wrong. And yet it exists even within our ranks, unconsciously, sometimes even consciously. All right. So, I want to give you some examples of white privilege. Life on the easy setting. Life on the easy setting means that most products and media are geared to you. It means that people will trust you, that you deserve to be where you are. Life on the easy setting means that you have a generally positive relationship with police and authority, that is not threatening to you as a default. Life on the easy setting means that your history is part of the core curriculum in your school, while others are electives. It means that you are paid better than another for doing the same amount of work. And in this case, life on the easy setting means that you don't need to worry or even particularly identify that you have a race. And you don't need to worry about race. Your race. That's life on the easy setting. And, I know that this is hard to hear. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. This actually is just an analytical tool. It is observation. And if you could be the scientist for a little bit and not feel entirely named, I think you might find it quite useful. That said, so there's a cognitive part, and I think we could go through and I can give you more and more facts. I can give you more and more examples and histories, and you would get it. Yes, I get cognitively that this is a supremacist culture privileging white people. However, there is an emotional component to this that oftentimes overrides our cognitive abilities. Unconsciousness about this, however, unconsciousness about white supremacy leaves us exposed to an emotional reaction when we are confronted with it, with our setting in it, with our contributing to its maintenance from time to time. And when we become both unconscious and emotional, oh boy, we are capable of harm. We are capable of damaging this world and people in it. So intention is better than being unconscious. Let us be intentionally dismantling white supremacy. But due to the personal and cultural differences that I spoke about earlier, our impact when we enter into this journey together, our impact is often not what we intended it to be. And that can be really frustrating and put us right back in this feeling of being bad people. And that's not what we're trying to do. Luckily, this group has a covenant to help us maintain relationship as we work out unintended hurts. As we work out when the impact of of my intention is not what I wanted it to be, where I've hurt you on accident even when I was trying to do something that I thought was good. But I think there is something beyond intent that can help us. What we want is conscious engagement, being conscious of the legacy in which we have come to be, the legacy that has benefited some and oppressed others. That can help us as much as covenant when it comes to hanging in the tough times. When you do hurt somebody's feelings while trying to do this good work, being conscious of the background and the history where you're coming from, where they're coming from as much as you can, will help you give a full dimensionality to the interaction and keep you in and not send you running when you get stung because you've accidentally stung somebody else. So one way of being conscious that's not really what we do as Unitarian Universalists. We think consciousness, I think culturally, tends to happen here all the time. That we ignore the rest of our body. And even maybe the spirit, if you want to go with me here, the spiritual integration with our body. We ignore or do not even attend to or compute where the emotional impact of an experience is in our body. And so as a practice of becoming more aware, we can consider where everything I have just said is residing in your body. See, because we have to know ourselves. That's all this is. That's all this is. It hurts if you've assumed that you've been perfect up till now. And we tend to do that, I think. We want to be good people. And just because you've made mistakes or were born into a nasty system doesn't mean you're bad people. It does mean that we have work to do. And we play a part in this. You play a part in this. You play a part in white supremacy culture. The question is, what part do you want to play? I invite you to help me think about this, reflect on it together, learn about our histories, so that we may identify when white supremacy culture is occurring either culturally or institutionally or personally, and then attempt to root it out. White culture in and of itself is a neutral thing. It's culture. It becomes malignant when it is used as the primary and the norm, and everything else is either because of that primary seat or norming, or even more insidiously, simply oppressed. That's when it becomes insidious. So we have to become comfortable with discomfort because the road ahead is fraught with it. It is not a path for those who are afraid of failure. It's a path, though, that we all need to take. And if you need to turn away for a few minutes or months and collect yourself and become accustomed to the reality of this that this observation reveals, Okay. For those of you who are ready to jump in right now and make mistakes with me, we are going to be offering a workshop. It's not a class. There is not a leader of this class who's qualified to teach it. But Chuck Tatum, myself, and Hannah Coy have been setting up a 4-part series that we invite you to come explore this reality, this way of understanding reality that has the hope of making the dream of America come true. And it's a good dream. It hasn't come to reality yet. And we have this opportunity. Pain is a growth opportunity. Discomfort is a growth opportunity. I don't know if anybody else saw it. I'm going to say where I saw it in case somebody else saw it. And it makes me seem less smart than I am, but I saw a Facebook thing this week about a rabbi talking about lobsters that only grow when they become too big for their shell and it starts to be uncomfortable. It starts to be uncomfortable. And so they go and they hide and they ditch their shell. They grow a new shell and then they wander back out into the world, right? But it is the discomfort that is the impetus for growth. So this is not just about a social, institutional, governmental, national, cultural revolution, although it is about all of those things. It is also about a spiritual evolution of yourself. And it is a way to be a more whole person. So if you would please find your journals at this point. Oh, incidentally, the class is going to begin on Wednesday evenings at 6:30 for 2 hours, starting February 6th, and there will be 4 sessions. If you need a journal and you didn't get one on the way in, Tom will hand you one right now. For those of you who are new to this practice, this is an opportunity to reflect yourself in writing. In these congregational journals. After I give you the prompt, you'll have 4 minutes or so to respond in words or pictures, if you wish, in your journal. And these are anonymous, so please don't sign your name. They're public, and they give us practice being reflective and vulnerable and generous. And if you read them after practice or before practice, they give you the opportunity to understand the hearts and minds of those who fill these pews. So here is your prompt. And it will be, I think, maybe very challenging. So I wish you all luck. I want you to think about what I said about feeling this in your body. I want you to think about what I said about feeling this in your body. And then write about where that sensation occurred. Did it occur in your neck, or your back, or your heart, or your stomach? Your ankle? That would be strange, but maybe it did. And then just free form right after that. Where did it feel? And maybe explore what that might mean for you. So you've got 4 minutes, and you may begin. Where did you feel this sermon in your body? This reflection.